Good evening, everyone. We will wait for folks to join as I see them starting to connect here. Okay, let's get started. We've got around 200 people join us tonight. Thanks, everyone, so much for coming. Tonight's presentation is Arctic Glow, a photographic journey through Iceland's midnight sun. I'm Bruce Magnuson. I've done a number of presentations for Chelmsford Library and other organizations locally. I'm a photographer based in Chelmsford. Most of my presentations kind of combine travel, art, and history. This one will be more travel and history, not too much art, since we were outside most of the time and it was the Arctic sun, so we had daylight pretty much 24 hours a day. So I'll get started with the agenda and preamble. We do have a chat and Q&A. If you want to pop questions into Q&A, I'll try to take a break through different sections. I have about 5 or 6 different sections that I go through, and I'll try to remember to take a break after each one to kind of grab the questions that come up during that time, since as you move along, it'd be a little bit awkward to go back to places we've already covered. So with that, we'll start off with a pithy quote from Oscar Wilde. Icelanders are the most intelligent race on Earth because they discovered America and didn't tell anyone. So with that, our itinerary, we'll start off with a geography of Iceland, the island. We'll delve a little bit into its history and culture. And then we'll kind of get on the road, start in Reykjavik, the capital, and we'll move to the famous Golden Circle outside of Reykjavik. We'll take a trip down south on the south coast of Iceland, end up in the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, and we'll do a wrap-up. So with that, the geography is Iceland. Pretty fascinating place. It was first settled in 870. The current population is around 372,000 people, with about 2/3 of those residing in the Reykjavik metro area. It's about 40,000 square miles, which is approximately the size of Ohio. It's 310 miles west to east and 190 miles north to south, with 3,000 miles of coastline. 11% of it is covered by glacier. We'll see a little bit of that. And at the original, before humans came on board there, it was 25 to 40% forest. Today is only about 2%. 98% do speak English. And it has the first directly elected woman president in 1980 and the first openly gay premier in 2009. So geographically, it's actually in a pretty fascinating neck of the woods, which you necessarily wouldn't really think about all the time, as this is the Arctic and it's kind of a forbidden and foreboding area. But from a geopolitical perspective, it's right in the middle of a thing called the Juke, which is Greenland, Iceland, and UK. So that is a part of the Norwegian Sea, Atlantic Ocean, in the Arctic, and it's a strategic importance because if you look over here, we have Russia, and in order for Russia, they have some naval outposts up here. In order for them to get out to the North Atlantic, they have to go by Iceland, either to the west or to the east. So from that perspective, it is a very, very important geopolitical thing. It's a very small island, but its location is incredibly important. And it is a member of NATO. And you can see here is all the members of NATO, with Sweden in the midst of getting admitted to NATO. It is not an official member of the EU, the European Union. So as a result, the euro is not the currency there. They had the Icelandic krona. But as people are familiar with when you travel to Europe, there are kind of a lot of nuances with the EU and some other different, kind of really residual from the European Common Market that was started post-World War II. And so Iceland is a member of the EFTA, which means from a travel perspective, they're a member of the Schengen group of countries, which means that those people who have passports, they can basically travel border free among the different countries. Does not apply to the United States. We're not a member of Schengen, but from that perspective, it is really connected to Europe. It does not have a standing army, but as we'll see in a second, it does have a very interesting military history. But as I said, it is a member of NATO. The climate, particularly in Reykjavik, is a little bit more moderate than you might think when you're that far north, because the northern tip of Iceland really is just on the edge of the Arctic Sea. But as you see from the temperature in Reykjavik, the average temperature from January through December, the average high, the lowest it gets is 38 degrees in December. and the highest it gets is 60 degrees in July. So my family and I, we were there at the end of June and early July, and we were basically in the mid 40s to mid 50s range. When we went south, and we'll see that in the south coast, it was actually fairly warm that day. It was in the mid 60s, even up to 70. And because the sun basically is shining 24 hours a day, it really does feel warmer than that. So this is the currents in the North Atlantic. And you see the Gulf Stream, goes all the way up here and has a large effect on Northern Europe and makes places like the UK, quite frankly, a lot more moderate than they normally would be at that particular latitude. And so there is this drift that goes off of the Gulf Stream and brushes the south of Iceland. So it makes Iceland a more temperate place than you might think being on the edge of the Arctic Circle. That being said, as we'll see at least in one photograph, it still does, obviously, with the glaciers and everything else. It certainly has its share of winter. But Reykjavik, in and of itself, really isn't that cold. It is heavy precipitation, though, mostly in rain. So, from a geographic perspective, it's in a fascinating location because it literally is between two continents. So these are the plates, the tectonic plates that basically make up the Earth crust. And so you see here we have the North American plate, which covers North America. And here's the Eurasian plate. And those plates literally meet in the middle of Iceland. So those plates are gradually moving apart. I think it's like, I don't know, 1 to 2 millimeters a year. But as a result, that is really the main reason that Iceland is the land of fire and ice, particularly the fire part, because there were volcanoes there with magma and stuff kind of erupting. You see a lot of what goes on in the Iceland landscape has been impacted by recent volcanic activity, so recent that there's actually a volcano going on right now in Grindavik or Grindavik, which is down here south of Reykjavik, actually near the Blue Lagoon. And they've had eruptions this year to the point that it is actually the lava has covered some of the roads down there. So it is a very, very active volcanic location. And the major thoroughfare around Iceland is the Ring Road, which is 821.5 miles. That goes all the way around. And we basically, our trip kind of was to start in Reykjavik. We went up here to the north, and then we go down to the south coast. We made it south as Vik. But this is about, and it depends upon, how quickly you can do it. It's, from what I heard, 7 to 10 days to take the trip all the way around the Ring Road. We did meet a father and a son who were going to bicycle the Ring Road. Unfortunately, they had ran into a flat tire and had to go back to Reykjavik to try and replace their tire. And I'm not sure, as we'll see when we get into the Ring Road and actually how it's designed. As a bike rider myself, I don't think I'd be doing a bike ride around the Ring Road. But it's not least of which is the wind speeds in Iceland are pretty consistent. It is a very windy place. So we will dive. Somebody says, will this be recorded? Yes, it will be recorded. So for folks who join or anybody who signed up for it, actually the library will send you out a recording of this presentation. I think within a week. They do a really good job of putting that together. So the history and culture, fascinating place. The Althing is the parliament of Iceland, still in existence today. It first met in 930 AD, and it was used as a way, it was met outside, and we'll get to the Thingvellir where this is actually located. This is a flag that marks the spot where they met, and this is actually where the continents separate, the tectonic plates separate in Iceland. And they convened this parliament, for lack of a better term, in 930 AD. And I think it met continuously till about the late 1700s, and it has since reconvened. I mean, some people say it's the longest continuous governing body in the world, which isn't, I guess, technically accurate since there have been some disruptions to it, but it's been around for a long time. And Iceland is also known for its sagas. The actual term saga is an Icelandic word. It means stories. And this gentleman, Snorri Sturluson, is one of the famous, he was one of these kind of almost mythical figure in Icelandic history. He was a politician, he was a nobleman, he also was a writer. And so in medieval Iceland, he put down a lot of these sagas and wrote them down. And still to this day, to my understanding, they still teach them in the schools in Iceland. And they're these mythic stories, kind of like Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones, actually, part of it was filmed in Iceland. A couple of seasons they did filming in Iceland. And as when you go to Iceland, you can see this is a great place to do that. It's a very dramatic landscape. And so these sagas are really, really embedded in the culture of Iceland. And you see the references to those quite a bit. And like I said, they still teach them in the schools today. So Icelandic sovereignty, it has gone through kind of a checkered past, but it was settled by the Norwegians, the original settler. We'll see a statue to him shortly in the early or late 800s, early 900s. It was under Norwegian kings until 1380. And then it was kind of in this quasi, it seemed like, shared relationship with Denmark, and it was formally ceded to Denmark in 1814. 1918, after World War I, it becomes a fully sovereign state, but still shares the Danish king. And then basically toward the end of World War II, it becomes the independent republic that we know to it today. So talking about World War I and World War II in Iceland, it's actually kind of fascinating because once again, as I mentioned, it's this really, really geopolitical important location. And so the Nazis basically wanted to take it over. And the Icelanders were officially neutral. And they said, no, no thanks. And then the British said, we want to take you over. And they said, no thanks. And the British said, well, we're going to invade anyway. And so they basically had a bloodless invasion, excuse me, and they occupied Iceland during World War II. And Britain was short on resources. U.S. joins the war in Europe in the 1942. And basically, Britain says, okay, we're going to get out of here. We're going to have the Americans take over. So the U.S. takes over, and they basically have a military base there until 2006. And it is actually around the major airport that's south of Reykjavik today, called Keflavik Airport, and that was a active military base with the U.S. Army until 2006. So as I said, Iceland itself does not have an army, but they've had military installations on there for quite a while. And certainly a lot of the culture, and you see this incredible change in Iceland after the end of World War II from a modernization perspective. Really, prior to World War II, it is mostly like agriculture, people literally living in huts with sod roofs and that kind of stuff. And then after World War II, it goes into an accelerated modernization. And today, it's a very, very modern um, uh, country. And certainly, when you go there as a tourist, you're not slumming it. It's a very, very nice place as far as that goes. Oddly enough, there, because the landscape is so brutal, it was actually used as a training site for the lunar landing. So Neil Armstrong and those crews went there in the mid 60s and actually did some of their training in the lava fields here, kind of in north central eastern Iceland, and they came back in 1965 and 1967. So a lot of times Iceland gets referred to as a moonscape, and that was actually kind of literal because it really does look kind of like a moonscape. And there's, obviously there's no glaciers on the moon, but from the rock perspective and all these lava fields, as the magma has come up over the centuries, millennia, has created this very, very stark landscape. And they've said that was NASA said that's probably the best place to kind of replicate what it might be like on the moon, at least as far as the topography was. And from an economic perspective, it's got kind of a interesting economics. The ICT is actually information technology. Obviously, fishing is a huge component of their economy, tourism. The one that's a little bit outside of it is aluminum. And you would kind of ask, like, why is aluminum a huge part of the Icelandic economy? And the reason is, I'm no expert or engineer, but aluminum, you have to smelt it. So you take the various elements together, and it needs a lot of energy to create aluminum, to smelt these different things together. And one thing there's really two things that are cheap in Iceland. Nothing else really is cheap, but hot water and electricity are both cheap in Iceland, and that's because of the geothermal. So they have, it's a very, very active area. They have all these geothermal activity, and they've been able to harness that for both hot water and for electricity. So as a result, electricity is very, very cheap. That is, I guess, the biggest variable as far as cost goes for making aluminum. So it's cheaper to ship all the components there and actually do the smelting on Iceland because the electricity is so cheap. And if you look in the countryside, this is just going south of Reykjavik, and you'll see these smokestacks everywhere, and they are geothermal. And it's almost like you have your own personal little geothermal plant. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to go to, like I said, we didn't do much in the museum part, and there are some great museums there on stuff like volcanoes and geothermal. But because the daylight was what it was, we were out and about in the countryside for, 12, 14 hours a day. But geothermal, certainly as you go south of Reykjavik in particular, you see these geothermal plants that are everywhere. And so even the Airbnb we stayed in, the hot water, it had that sulfuric kind of rotten egg smell to it. Well, we took a tour the first day we were there with a local guy who lived his whole life in Reykjavik, and he was telling us that the hot water is so cheap that he actually just keeps his shower going almost in the morning to make a sauna. And there are no hot water heaters. They're actually just pipes. The hot water comes directly into your flat, your house, or whatever. And you have kind of like unlimited hot water, which is neat, except for the fact that it has a bit of a sulfuric tinge to it, which took a little bit of getting used to. And another thing that Iceland is famous for is the Icelandic horses. There were approximately 80,000 of those. We'll see pictures of sheep in a second. The story supposedly is there's like over 300,000 sheep and 80,000 horses, Icelandic horses. So there's a sheep for every person and a horse for every family. And so the Icelandic horse is a very specific breed. It was brought over by the Vikings when Iceland was settled in the 900s. And the horse is a pure breed in the fact that if there's a big market in selling Icelandic horses, and there's an Icelandic horse farm actually up in Vermont, here in New England. But once an Icelandic horse leaves Iceland, it can never return. And so they don't want to bring in any kind of disease or anything else. So the Icelandic horses that are there, there's a market for selling them, but once they leave, they cannot return. So I was kind of interested in Icelandic horses, and for whatever reason, I thought it'd be cool to ride one. So I convinced my family, much to their chagrin, that we should ride Icelandic horses. And people say, "Oh, they're ponies." Well, they're small, but they are a very, very formidable animal. I had literally have not ridden a horse in like over 50 years when I got on this horse. So it was a bit of a shock to me, and they kind of want to do what they want to do. And a lot of that is eating. And this is a quick video that a little taste of what a rider sitting on Icelandic horse is like.
Thank you.
So one thing you'll notice I have a few videos that I have here. One thing you'll notice in every single video that I took in Iceland, or we took in Iceland, that was actually taken by the tour guide, obviously, you're going to hear wind. And so I will say that Iceland, the first day we were there, the tour guide actually mentioned how it wasn't that windy. And of course, we didn't really think that much about it because all we knew was that one day. And but then as we spent more time in Iceland, we realized that wind is your constant companion, which is good. There's no mosquitoes in Iceland. There are these little black flies, particularly out in the countryside, and the wind did help keep them at bay. And so as you drive around, you'll just see these horses just out everywhere. I'm not quite sure exactly how the ownership works, but they're everywhere, as are the sheep. And the sheep are just out grazing. You don't see any barns or anything. I assume at some point they're corralled by some sort of shepherd type operation, but as you drive around, there are sheep in the road. They have the right of way. That's a real thing. But it is obviously kind of cool that these things are in this vast landscape and there's these sheep everywhere. And the only indigenous mammal to Iceland is the Arctic fox. So my wife actually took this picture, and we'll see this lighthouse further on down the road. We were around the lighthouse, and I saw these photographers there with these long lenses, and I was kind of like, okay, what are they doing? And sure enough, they were all focusing on this Arctic fox that was in the field, I don't know, 10 or 20 yards away, and he didn't really seem to care too much about it, but that is the only indigenous mammal on Iceland. Since then, there have been, I think coyotes are there. Certainly, I think mice and rats have ended up, but the Arctic fox was the original. And of course, another thing about Icelandic culture are the spas. And so the most famous one is Blue Lagoon. As I mentioned, that one has actually been impacted by the volcano that's happened south of Reykjavik. And so much so that when we were there, one of the roads was closed. And as a result, to get to the Blue Lagoon would have been an extra, I think it was 45 minutes to an hour. And so Blue Lagoon is kind of on, not kind of, it's on the way from Reykjavik in the airport. So a lot of people will do the Blue Lagoon either coming or going from Iceland. Use it, on your way to the airport, build in some extra time, go to the Blue Lagoon. My wife and daughter came up with the Sky Lagoon, which is actually closer to Reykjavik and is supposedly less touristy, although it was still pretty touristy. They do have geothermal pools all over Iceland, and it's a big social thing for the Icelandic folks. They have, even like neighborhood ones, and they will go and, convene those after work and that kind of stuff. So it's a big part of their culture. This one was cool because it's an infinity pool type thing. And this is actually the North Atlantic right there. So the day we were there, once again, it was really windy and there's all these whitecaps that are going on in the North Atlantic. And we were in this kind of steam bath thing. So not a huge thermal pool person, I thought, but this is pretty cool and it's a unique experience. I mean, it's not cheap. Blue Lagoon is very expensive. Sky Lagoon's a little bit less so, but it was probably, it depends. They have all different levels of packages and stuff. I think it was like 70 to $100 per person. And we'll talk now about the famous or infamous fermented shark, which is something that you encounter either directly or anecdotally when you go to Iceland. And this is a 3-minute video or so from the National Geographic that kind of gives the whole breakdown and is a fascinating story of what it goes through for this thing. I think just a couple of quick YouTube ads, then we'll get to the video.
How often do we end up eating alone instead of with somebody that we love?
In the town of Reykjavik, Siggi, a traditional Icelandic cook, is preparing one of the signature meals of the Thorablat festival, as the Vikings once did.
You feel the pungent aroma of the shark.
This freshly caught 1,700-pound Greenland shark is naturally full of urea and other toxins. These chemicals act as antifreeze, allowing the shark to live in waters as cold as -2 degrees Celsius. The toxins are so concentrated that to eat this meat could make you seriously ill or possibly even kill you. But Hildebrandr Bjarmas's family has a secret shark recipe that goes back generations. And he knows that the only way to prepare it is to let it rot. As the meat decomposes, it oozes toxic ammonia, the chemical found in most household cleaning products, and human waste.
I don't want to say the word. This will probably describe it best. Pee.
In Viking times, shark meat was buried out of sight, but Hildebrandr prefers to see his delicacy. That way he can keep track of the decaying process.
His nose decides when it is ready to try. It's like winemaking, you know?
When the meat is at a perfect rotten state, it's hung to complete the breakdown process. After 6 months, it's ready to be served.
Þessi fínnar, þetta alveg hreint. Þú sér það, þetta alveg hreint.
Yeah. This is going to be very good. It has 2 more months. It's going to be a great shark, this one.
It's a social thing for us to come together and eat this.
I don't like the shark.
It's like ammonia.
Taste and smell like fish. It does.
Despite this feast of oddities, these Icelandic partygoers see nothing bizarre about tonight's main courses. No matter what dish is served, Siggi and the Icelanders agree there is more to this tradition than just taste.
The point is taking care of this tradition, having fun with it, know what it is, don't forget it, don't forget where we come from.
Okay, so it's not going to make you run to Iceland for their culinary treats, but once again, this is a far northern Atlantic place. Protein is kind of hard to come by, certainly in the winter, so this is what you end up having from an ancestral point of view. But it is a real part of the culture, and they advertise it. And so we went to a restaurant in the Snaefellsnes Peninsula, and they had the Viking experience, where you get a piece of this, and you get some of their very potent alcohol. And we said no thanks. So they came back later and said, "Would you do eat the shark for free?" I'm like, well, okay. So they gave us these little cubes of shark, and it was funny because the waitress was actually from the Czech Republic. A lot of the people who work um, the tourist trades in Iceland are from Central and Eastern Europe, like a lot of places. Certainly here in New England, we have people who work the summers from various parts of the world, and they come over here. And she was very, very adamant about us having it. And the thing she told us is, don't chew on it too much because you'll get the ammonia. So it was basically kind of like taking a piece of chewing gum and swallowing it, which, once again, I'm not sure what the point is, but it is, when in Rome. And they give us a button afterwards saying we survived it and I'm a Viking. So it's fun. It's an interesting tradition. And I'm sure there's some subtleties to it, and there are people who really get into the various nuances of this. But you can't really talk about Icelandic cuisine without going down that. And the other part that's kind of interesting is how they do their surnames. It's a small island, only 350,000 people. So from the father's point of view, basically the son, so the father's name is Egil, and the son becomes Egilson, and the daughter becomes Egil Deuter. So that's pretty much how then she has a different first name. So this is how you can track the lineage of who the father is of the various children. So that's pretty much how it goes. We'll get into it in a second. My last name is Magnuson, which is Scandinavian, which of course means son of Magnus. As my dad always told me, that means son of the Great One. So with that, we'll change and begin actually to travel around and start with Reykjavik. We'll take a quick look at some of the questions here. Are there any forests in Iceland? And no, not really. Like I said, it's down to 2% of the trees. I would argue, look at my photos and you won't see very many trees, no less forests. So this is down to 2%. Once again, it's a northern area. So, pre-modern times for heating, they're going to need wood. And if you've ever actually tried to heat a house all year or all winter in a very, very cold climate, it is astounding how many cords of wood you need. Certainly the colonists here in New England got a very harsh lesson on that when they came over, in the 1600s. So there are not really a lot of forests in Iceland at all. The red and blue dots, that was the map. I think those were definitely bases that were on Iceland during the war. And somebody said they had an uncle who was in the Seabees in World War II, and they were in an airport. Like I said, I don't know how many airports there were in Iceland. I think there were more than one, but the big one was Keflavik, and that did become the U.S. Army base. So the chances are that's probably what he was working out of, because that was a very, very large military installation for quite a long time, for 50 years or so, almost 60 years. So let's see if we have any other questions. What was the average temp of a geothermal spa? That's kind of interesting. I want to say 100 degrees. I mean, it was warm. It wasn't, I mean, there's various ones. There's natural ones. There's ones that you go out, into the countryside, and they say you have to be careful because the water is so hot. So you have to know what you're getting into. These ones that are done for the tourists, I mean, I'm sure have some way of maintaining the consistent one. It was pleasantly warm when it was like 50 something degrees and the wind blowing. It was very nice. It says, what kind of music do they like? Well, Iceland is really famous for its, I mean, the most famous Icelandic singer recently is, of course, Bjork, who was in the band the Sugar Cubes. And so you have that kind of indie, I mean, her stuff kind of goes off the wall, but it's a very, very strong music scene. They have a big music festival there in the summer, right in downtown Reykjavik, and one of the tour guides was telling us about that. So certainly music and contemporary music is a huge part of the Icelandic culture, and it does have a very huge club culture as well. And is it possible that Iceland will become two islands due to the plates? Probably at some point. I mean, everything's changing. I don't know how long it would take 1 or 2 millimeters a year, but yes, Iceland is a very dynamic scape. And of course, as you see, there was a famous eruption, I think it was the one in 2010, that caused all the air traffic problems. That actually reshaped the harbor as to where it was. And so you can even see that in Cape Cod. We get these big storms in Cape Cod, and I know Chatham Harbor got reshaped from a nor'easter relatively recently. But it's very dynamic, and it really does give you this visceral view into how dynamic the Earth is. And Iceland is right at the top of that. So will it be two islands? Will it become a bigger island because of lava? who knows? There's a lot of stuff going on there, but it's going to change. That much we can be certain of. Okay. Do you think it would be better to take a drive or take a cruise ship that stops around Iceland? That is totally personal preference. The one thing I've learned about cruises, I've never been on one myself. When I go to these places that are very, very popular tourist places, which Iceland certainly is, what you don't get from the tourism perspective is, from the cruise perspective is, you typically obviously spend your time, your night on the cruise ship. So you come in during the day when all the crowds are there, and then you go at night to the cruise ship. Now, Reykjavik is your only urban center. So that's less of an issue here. I think it's a bigger issue when you go to places like Venice, where you miss out being in Venice at night, which is just unbelievable. I think with a cruise, you could probably get around and visit more stuff easily. With a car, obviously you have more control. And car rental is very expensive. I think it costs us like $150 a day. Gas is very expensive. It was like $8 a gallon. They do it in liters, but the equivalent was about $8 a gallon. We do see a lot of Teslas because the electricity is so cheap. Now, how they do in the cold weather, I'm not sure. But certainly, cruising versus they have their different, pros and cons. I will say driving the ring road by yourself, you know, it's pretty, once you get outside of a couple of hours of Reykjavik, you're in some incredibly remote stuff. And we actually had, I'll get into it in the South Coast, but we had a little tire issue in the South Coast, and that became a possible challenge. So, we'll move on to Reykjavik. It's the capital here, and it's in the southern port, southwestern part of Iceland. This is our Airbnb. One thing that I was kind of fascinated by, the siding in the housing is corrugated metal. Back to the whole thing about wood. The wood basically got kind of used up, and so they had to come up with different kinds of material that they could use to side their houses against the brutal weather. And this is one that I have not really seen too much of, and I was kind of interested in that, so that's why I took a picture of it. But once again, you're dealing with the elements, and you have to come up with what works. So the most famous church in Reykjavik is and I'm going to try some of these Icelandic pronunciations. It's a notoriously difficult language to speak. This is the Hallgrímskirkja, which is the big church. It is a Lutheran church. It was built after the war. It is dominating. Our Airbnb was literally like 2 blocks away from that. So it's kind of a great orient for us. It was easy because we were driving around. It's like, how do we get back to our apartment? Well, just look for the church. And there's all kinds of parking things in Iceland, in Reykjavik, about different lots and what the cost is. And the ones around the church are actually free. So for a couple of days, we were actually able to park free. I mean, it was hard to find a spot sometimes, and we did have to pay sometimes. But parking in Reykjavik actually wasn't as difficult as I thought. And that statue you saw in front is Leif Erikson. This picture was taken at 11 p.m. at night, the first night we got there. The sun kind of sort of sets, I guess. We didn't stay up 24 hours to actually validate this, but it's called civil twilight, which it doesn't really go below the horizon, I guess, at all, or just barely. And so you, for all intents and purposes, have 24-hour daylight, which is, I'll be frank, it's weird. They don't do the room darkening shades as well as I would have thought they would have. And you have to wake up in the middle of the night. It can be hard to get back to sleep because it's pretty bright, and obviously your whole circadian rhythm is out of whack. The plus side is, we were visiting waterfalls at like 9:30 at night, and it was obviously perfect daylight. So it's pretty wild. If you saw my presentation on Boston statues, my whole story on Leif Erikson. There is a statue in Boston, Leif Erikson, which probably isn't appropriate. It is certainly inappropriate to have a statue of Leif Erikson right in downtown Reykjavik, and they do. And so this church is interesting because the architect wanted to reference the landscape of Iceland in his design. And so this design references the basalt stacks, which basalt is like the major rock that comes out of volcanoes, I guess. And so we'll get to this black beach in the south area of Iceland, but there are these basalt stacks right along the beach. And so he did this design to reference the basalt stacks. I thought was kind of cool to bring that right into his church. There's the interior of it. You can go up in the tower. There are the bells. Unfortunately, we were there right at, I think they ring every 15 minutes. So that's a little bit of an experience, but you do get a great view of Reykjavik on all sides. Here, once again, is some of the geothermal steam that's coming off. This is kind of looking over the harbor and the mountains across. The mountains, I mean, there are a lot of them. They aren't think the tallest one is about 7,000 feet. So they aren't, gigantic type of things, kind of New England size. Mount Washington's the tallest in New England, it's about 6,200 feet. So they're kind of on that scale, but there's just a lot of them. And it's a very, very dramatic landscape. And obviously all the civilization is right in there. You really can't get away from this stuff. So Reykjavik is kind of nestled right in the harbor, surrounded by these mountains. And this is the Rainbow Road, which as you see leads up to the church. This is one of the kind of local experiences we did. It was a fish place that we actually ended up eating outside, which I wouldn't think I would be doing in Reykjavik, but the weather wasn't too bad, and we were able to do that. And it's a kind of a quick service place. Go up and order, and they have all kinds of different fish and chowder. Certainly, fish chowder is a big thing there. We had multiple bowls of that in our visit, but that was kind of a neat little local experience of waiting in line to get local fish. And as I mentioned before, this is the founder of Iceland, Ingólfur Arnarsson, and there's a major statue to him right in downtown Reykjavik. We're actually right around the area where they had the music festival in the summer. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my quasi namesake, Skúli Magnuson with two S's. There's always a big debate as to why Magnuson has two S's versus one in some cases. Got a guy in my neighborhood with two S's and we had one. He pronounced it Magnuson. But this guy is actually kind of the guy given the title of founding Reykjavik, because Reykjavik was a very, very small outpost. And so he came there and from a political and commercial perspective, kind of made it more of a trading hub in trade with Denmark. And that kind of led to the rise of Reykjavik. So they basically kind of consider him the kind of founding spirit of Reykjavik. I will say from an artistic perspective, the statue really reminds me of like Soviet era statues that you would see in Eastern Europe. It's kind of a brutalist type thing. So I said from the art perspective, what I saw on the outside of Reykjavik certainly didn't blow me away. But I'm never going to pass up a famous Magnuson. And this one is pretty humorous. It's called The Unknown Bureaucrat. And so it's a bureaucratic guy with a briefcase and a big stone, a big rock. So that's probably the most interesting sculpture that you'll see in Reykjavik. So we'll move on to the Golden Circle, the famed Golden Circle, where a lot of the different elements of Iceland are on view. We'll take a quick look here. Do they still eat whale meat? Yes, they do. They eat whale meat and they eat puffin. There's a big thing about they smoke puffin. Puffin cruises are a big, the puffins have I think it's the biggest colony in the world there in the summer. So certainly puffin cruises. It's a little challenging because the ocean is very rough. So I'm not sure how often these cruises actually go off because the time we were there, most of the time the ocean was a place I would not want to be on. But definitely you will see whale meat and you will see puffin on the menu in restaurants. I did not partake of either. Okay, let's see if we. Okay, a lot of people putting stuff in the chat, so. I was almost kidnapped by an Icelandic horse. It ran off, it would not stop. I can certainly identify with that. So the neighborhood pools are cheap. That is absolutely true. Somebody has a boyfriend's mother who served a sheep head as a treat. That's another biggie, which we did not partake of. So Leif versus Leif Erikson. I try to have Leif Erikson, but people say Leif, people say Leif. But he is kind of he purportedly, came over to Newfoundland, Lamansal Meadows, which is the only actual archaeological site in North America that I think it was a temporary settlement for the Vikings, but that was the only real archaeological evidence that they were in North America, and that does get attributed to Erikson. So we will move now to the Golden Circle. And the Golden Circle, once again, to orient ourselves, we're here in Reykjavik. If you head here kind of northeast, I think most of the tour buses go this way, which is counterclockwise. So we thought we would kind of mix it up, go this way and go counterclockwise and maybe avoid some of the crowds. And that seemed to work pretty well. Although once again, like I said, because the sunlight was just, 24 hours, we left fairly early in the morning, came back fairly late. And I think the bus tours have a narrower window and, typical bus tour, they get you there, you have your 15 minutes and you get in the bus and go again. But we didn't run into really that many crowds at this part of our trip, which is nice because the Golden Circle certainly is the most famous geological thing that you see. And this is the Icelandic road. I believe this actually is the ring road, but most of the roads outside of Reykjavik are like this. There are two lanes. They, each way. They sometimes have striping, they sometimes don't. They don't have much of a shoulder at all. Back to my point about riding a bike, this would not be my choice to ride a bike on a road like this. They weren't, wasn't a lot of traffic, and there were some places where it was four lanes wide, two lanes on each way. But the thing that's interesting, particularly being a photographer, and I'd watched a couple of videos about driving in Iceland because we were going to rent a car and everything. And one of the things they said is, there's no pull-offs really. There are a couple of places where there's some gravel roads you can kind of pull off, but you're going to see these amazing vistas. And of course, as a photographer, my natural inclination is let's pull over and grab a shot of that. And this video is really good. They say you're going to see like as many photos as you want to take, but you have to be smart about it. And so that was something really that was a little bit of a challenge to, be frustrated not being able to like pull over right when I see a great shot. But this road is, I mean, I couldn't imagine driving these roads in the winter. I mean, there is no leeway for error. So, but that being said, they're very well paved. I mean, coming from Massachusetts, what I would never describe Massachusetts paved roads for the most part as being very well paved. But and we were there I think about 2 or 3 weeks after we left in South Iceland. One of the glacial rivers overflowed and took out part of the ring road. So, to the point about will it become two islands at one point, who knows? But like I said, it's very dynamic and there's a lot of stuff going on. But it's certainly driving it was pretty easy. There's some pretty funky rotaries around Reykjavik, but once again, being from the Boston area, rotaries are not a problem. They do deal with them a little bit differently, but they're polite. And like I said, on the ring road, there isn't a lot of traffic. But the one thing you have to be careful of is F roads. And F roads are the roads that you really only can go on if you have a vehicle that can like ford water, which is a very specific vehicle. So you want to pay attention. We didn't have any problems. I've heard stories of people using Google Maps. And we all have stories. In the United States, we end up in these kind of crazy places where Google Maps will put you. Sometimes I think Google Maps can put you on an F road. When we get to one of the waterfalls, I will talk about the road that it took to get down there. But in general, when you're on the paved roads, it is very, very well maintained and very easy to get around. The first stop is the Carrot Crater, which, as far as the Golden Circle goes, is probably one of the lesser spectacular things. If this was in New England, it would probably be the number one tourist attraction in New England. In Iceland, it's like, oh, there's a crater with water. You can walk all around. You can walk down to it. Yeah, okay. So you spend, 20 minutes or a half hour there and move along. But once again, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. Of course, this is, remnants of a dormant volcano. The more famous location is Geyser, and the term geyser actually comes from that. And, the Old Faithful and stuff like that, that is an Icelandic word. The actual geyser that gives the name to the term is fairly dormant. I think it does actually go off every so often, but the story is that so many tourists threw rocks in it that it actually kind of just interfered with its actual process. But the one that is a lot more frequent is called stroker, which I think means churn or butter churn. And that one goes off every 4 to 5 minutes. It's very short and it's very intense and it's very frequent. So it's pretty cool. So we will give you a video of what it actually looks like. So that's the Stoker geyser, and it is neat. They said, we saw that with the kind of the bubble, the cresting happens, and that's when the thing is about to go off. But it happens very quickly. But like I said, it happens every 4 to 5 minutes. It was pretty consistent. We were there, so we saw it probably 4 or 5 times. So you definitely have no problem seeing that. It's pretty cool. And the Gotafoss, supposedly in Icelandic, the two L's give you kind of a TL sound. So it's actually in Icelandic, it's Gotafoss. And this is a very large, probably the most famous waterfall in Iceland, but it's just astounding. Everywhere you turn, you're like, oh, there's a waterfall, there's another waterfall. And once again, any one of those would be the most amazing waterfall in New England. but they're everywhere. This one is exceptional. We'll get to a couple more that are exceptional. And once again, I think video kind of gives you a little bit of the experience. And this is the blue waterfall. This actually, the term Brewerfoss actually means bridge waterfall. Foss is waterfall. But what it's noted for is its blue water, and that's because of the minerals that are coming from the glacier upstream. And so it is, once again, this kind of just amazing thing. What's challenging about it, it's not typically the thing that most people go to on the Golden Circle because you have to drive. It's not an F road officially, but it was truly a moonscape. I mean, Neil Armstrong would have been very, very at home in this road. And so, we're in a rent-a-car, and you get halfway down, you're like, well, should I continue or should I go back? So we did continue, and was it worth it? Yeah, but it was definitely one of those roads you don't know when it's going to end. So it seems like it went a lot longer than it probably did, but it is a pretty amazing vista, and this blue water is just incredible. I have a close-up here of the blue water, and it's once again otherworldly. But the road was just such a potholes, and it was a gravel road and everything else, and fortunately I don't think I did anything. I don't know. We'll talk about the tire problem a little bit later, but it was definitely an amazing, amazing sight. And as you get to the end of the thing, the Golden Circle, kind of going back toward Reykjavik, you get back to Thingvellir, which is, as I mentioned before, where the Althing started their parliament, and it literally is the separation of the continent. So these folks knew even back in 930 or whatever that this is an exceptional place. So this is what they chose for the location for all the chieftains to come together once a year in the summer. I think it was in June, and they would come and do all kinds of business, both legal business, political business, everything else. And it was done literally right here in the separation between the continents. And so you can walk right down that today. And this is the picture I showed before. That's the flag indicating where the folks met outside, and they now have a building in Reykjavik that they go to. And whoa, go back there. And that is a church that was built, I think, in the 1800s. I believe at one point one of the prime ministers actually lived there, but this is one of the quintessential photographic vistas in Iceland of this church here overlooking this river at Thingvellir and back into the landscape. And this is a close-up of the church with the entrance actually to the cemetery here as a shadow. So with that, we will take a look. And so are the businesses open 24 hours since the light is like 10 to 8? Nope. They said they have staffing problems like everywhere else. They have staffing problems. So we didn't really run into anything. I think actually some of the restaurants really weren't open that late, till like 9 o'clock. I'm sure the clubs were open late, but we weren't in that scene. We did go to the local grocery store. There's two grocery stores basically on Iceland. There's Bonus and one that begins with a K. Bonus was a couple of blocks from our Airbnb, so we brought groceries there. And they were open like 8 in the morning until like 9 at night. And said, what food do we eat? I have to say, the food was good. It wasn't cheap. A meal. The thing I'll say about Reykjavik is it's either kind of what I would consider relatively high-end dining or street food. There wasn't a lot in the middle. We did find on our way back, our last day there, we did find a food hall that was in Reykjavik, kind of like an indoor food court, and that was pretty good and pretty reasonable. But in general, to give you a sense, a good meal was about $35 an entree, which in comparison to Boston isn't bad because it did include tip and tax. So there was no additional tipping in Iceland. So when you get the bill, that's the bill. So from a perspective of that, you're on vacation, $35 for an entree. We ate a lot of fish for the most part, and it was very good. Salmon, Arctic char, that kind of stuff. No whale, no puffin. But I said we did have breakfast and lunch kind of on the road ourselves since we were on the road so much. And once you get outside of Reykjavik and you go to these places on the Golden Circle, you can grab a hot dog or whatever. There'll be a hot dog stand at some of the stops, but there isn't a lot of services out there. So we thought it was better for us and more flexible and more economical and healthier, quite frankly, to kind of bring our own food and have that. So we basically the only meal we ate out was dinner, and I can't say we had a bad meal. It was definitely good. And how much snow do they get? Reykjavik doesn't get that much snow. And I don't know the actual amount. It's not like this absurd amount. What I've heard is there's a precipitation like over 200 days a year. So, the old adage in New England is if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes. That's absolutely true in Iceland. The way it changes. And so as a photographer, I kind of want some sunlight, and I got a lot of different looks. Reykjavik was very variable. As you went to the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, it gets a little funkier. We'll talk a bit about that. But from, other parts of Iceland get a lot of snow. Reykjavik itself does not. It's fairly temperate. I don't know the number. I want to say it's like 40 inches or something, which, is kind of what Boston gets. It says, how high is the water in the geyser? I believe it's something that will burn you. There were certainly little puddles along the walkway back to our car in the parking lot, and there were signs to like, don't put your hand in the water. And let's see if I have anything else. Are the glaciers shrinking? They most certainly are. Somebody asked, was there a specific reason we decided to visit, and was your first time? Yes, it was our first time. Specific reason was, I said it's one of these places. Now I will say, living on the East Coast in America is amazing because it's a 4.5 hour flight from Logan in Boston to Reykjavik. We left at 12:30 in the afternoon, got into Reykjavik about 10 o'clock. So there's none of this overnight red eye stuff that kind of messes up your first day or two up in when you go to Europe. Amazing. And the Reykjavik airport's very modern. There was nobody there when we got there at 10 o'clock at night. On our return flight, it was a bit of a different story. It was kind of chaos, but super easy place to get to. So, and it's become this place, and it's just this phenomenal landscape. I have to say, my daughter kind of talked us into doing it. I was originally a bit skeptical, tend not to want to go places that are colder to where I live, but I would highly recommend that to go there. And certainly, around the summer solstice was amazing. I know people go there for the Northern Lights. That would make it difficult to see a lot of what we saw. So being able to, see this stuff is pretty much all during the day, and it is very easy to get to. It's, I wouldn't say it's ADA compliant. They don't have a lot of railings like we do in the U.S. for stuff, and you do kind of watch out what you're going. You're in some pretty wild stuff, and we'll get into that when we get to the Snæfellsnes Peninsula. That it can get pretty interesting with the weather and what you're exposed to there. So we will jump to the south coast. This is Reykjavik here. This is where we were at the Golden Circle. We head south on the Ring Road, and we'll go down as far as the town of Vik. And we'll see some amazing waterfalls and Black Beach and some other things, Black Sand Beach. This is a Seljalandsfoss, which is this, kind of Angel Falls thing where it's very narrow, but it's very high. The cool thing about it is you can go behind the falls. So as you walk behind here, it's like a cave here. This picture is actually taken from behind the falls. So there's not many times you can get pictures from behind the falls. You can get a picture in Niagara Falls behind Bridal Veil, but this is pretty unique. And it's an amazing place. And once again, you look across the plains here, and you see one little house and kind of a building here, and there's not much else, but it's a beautiful spot. And the cool thing is if you go to the left, you can actually go to another waterfall, and this is really in a cave, and it's falling here. There's a rock you can get up here, and just the water is almost literally falling on your head. So you're really, and you have to kind of walk through this slippery rock area, which is a little bit interesting. And the walls here are kind of slick with the green moss and everything, but it wasn't terribly treacherous, and the water wasn't terribly deep, although I did see people with wet shoes. But you get an amazing view here, but literally being in this cave with a waterfall pouring down into it. And you go further down the coast, you end up in this Reynisfjara beach, which is black sand. And these are the basalt stacks that I showed you before that the church in Reykjavik referenced. And there are some other sea stacks here. Black sand is a bit of a misnomer. I know all sand is, ground up rock, but it's not very fine. So I don't know if I want to spend any time laying on the beach. And once again, with the temperature being what it was, there's a couple of people who were actually down on the beach. But in general, it was very coarse, difficult to walk. And I will say, from all the places we went to, this is the one place where I would say it was kind of crowded, and a little bit too much so. And you'll see a little bit from this picture. So this is looking back the other way at some of these sea stacks. And you see just a lot of people there. And so the interesting thing about this is they give you all these warnings about things called sneaker waves. Here in New England, we have rogue waves. If you go up to Pemaquid Point, up in the Maine coast there are stories of people getting washed away. And this is a big thing there. There was actually a tourist who was washed away here in 2022. And these waves can literally come out of nowhere. So they tell you, don't turn your back on the ocean. And of course, you see that a lot of people, certainly don't pay attention to that. Did nothing happen the day we were there, but it's something you want to be aware of. And it is hard because, like I said, this is such an otherworldly environment that, particularly from where we are here in New England, you just don't see a lot of this stuff, and you're just kind of, taking it all in, and it's really hard to kind of focus. But, the water wasn't that rough, but they do warn that even if the water isn't rough, a rogue wave can come and it can get kind of funky. Because once again, this water is very cold, so once you get pulled in, your chances are not great. More of the sea stacks. Just beautiful landscape. Skogafoss, and usually these waterfalls are just kind of different attributes. You can get kind of, waterfalled out, but each one of them, these major waterfalls, were just such a different experience, and they were amazing. They were amazing. This one is as high. The volume is very high. You can get much closer to it than you can to Gullfoss. And the really cool thing about it is you walk up these stairs alongside of it, which, is a good cardio workout, but you end up on the top here. And there's a viewing deck. You can look down over the top, but then also you can just walk back in far as you want. And it's just an amazing landscape. And they're just waterfall after waterfall. And once again, you see like, oh, this is an amazing waterfall. And then you walk another 100 yards. Oh my God, there's another amazing waterfall. And you see, I think I have one more picture. Yeah, so you're seeing here, and then you've got, some of the glacier up here. This is looking back toward the ocean with this. And this is a trail, it's a little, it's not paved or gravel or anything, but it is marked off. And this is the place we really got to pay attention. I did see some tourists who were right on the edge and doing the selfie and, had their back to the waterfall and, had their hands in the air and stuff like that, which, one loose stone and you become a statistic. So I wouldn't recommend that, but it is an amazing. We did a hike. I don't even know how long it was, a mile, maybe 2 miles. But we could have probably hiked all the way up here. There was just went on and on and on, and it was astounding. And once again, this was fairly late in the afternoon. So the one thing I will say about the South Coast and Vic, I mentioned we had a tire problem. The tire problem wasn't. It was just the fact we got a low pressure warning. And once again, when you're in the middle of nowhere in a car in a country you're not familiar with, you get a little bit concerned. And plus, I had just been on this incredibly moonscapish road, and we said, I need to get some air. And it turned out that the only town we came to was Vic. But this to me is kind of a classic Icelandic story, because we got to Vic and I found the best air pump I've ever seen in my life. It was free. It was all digital. You just programmed it in. And of course, if you know where to, you open the driver's side door, and there's a sticker on every car that tells you what the tire pressure should be for all the different tires. You look at that, dial it in. It would actually take off pressure if you were over pressurized, and it would add pressure if you were under pressure. And so I don't know what set that sensor off. I know they can be kind of finicky. It was a little bit of a kind of heart in the throat moment when that first happened. We were right in the middle of the ring road, and going for a one day in South South Iceland, and we didn't have time to spend about trying to find, like, I don't know, I guess there is a mechanic somewhere in Vic, but these towns, there was not. We drove through Vic before I found the air pressure place, and it was like within 2 minutes we were outside south of Vic going on to the ring road. I'm like, oh, that was Vic. Got to come back and look for it. But we found it, and it was one of the best tourist shops we saw there too. It was amazing, and amazing Icelandic sweaters and stuff. So with that, the final stop we have is on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, and this is one that's not as well traveled. Certainly South Iceland, the Golden Circle, those are all the classic things you do outside of Reykjavik, and they're all a day's drive from Reykjavik. No problem doing those in the day and being back in Reykjavik for dinner. No issue at all. Snæfellsnes is a bit of a different animal, and it does stick out here. So you have Reykjavik down here, and this is the peninsula where the airport is for Reykjavik. And up here, you have Snæfellsnes Peninsula, so it's north of Reykjavik, and it's more remote. And we stayed in a town called Olsvik, which is out here kind of on the western portion of it. But it is a place well worth visiting, but you do get into the more, rustic and wilderness type of stuff. One of the cool things is you do go through this tunnel. And this tunnel was built, I think, within like the last 10 years. It's been paid off, so there's no more toll, which is nice. The longest tunnel I've ever been in. I don't know how long it took us to get through the tunnel. I want to say 20 minutes. My wife is not fans of closed-in spaces, so it probably seemed a lot longer to her. But as you can see, you cut across this, I guess it's actually a fjord. But before this tunnel, you had to drive all the way around here to continue up north to the Snæfellsnes. So this is cut off, I think, like an hour or more to our trip. So it's pretty neat. And the other thing you have to pay attention to is there are all these signs which give you information about weather conditions and road conditions where you're going. And the challenge with it is it's all in the metric system. So the wind speeds are in meters per second. And I have no idea what is good or bad for meters per second. What I do know is red is bad typically. So we were going north to the Snaefellsnes Peninsula, and they tell you the temperature, and like they tell you some of the roads, and this is the wind speed, and the wind speed was red. So I had some indication that we were going to be encountering some interesting wind. This is really important when you're here in the winter. I guess there's like 2 or 3 different websites that the rental car place says you need to check those before you drive anywhere, so you're aware of what the weather forecasts are for the places you're going. Because as I showed you before, these roads, the ring road in particular, is this 2-lane road, and you slip off that road, and I don't know, it's going to be an interesting odyssey, as it were. So this was kind of child's play compared to that. However, as you'll see, this was not an insignificant storm, because one of the things that they tell you is with the wind, you need to pay attention as to how you park your car. And my family laughed at me when I told them this, guys. I took this little course, online course about driving, and you don't want to park with the wind coming behind you, because if you open your car doors, you very likely can have your car doors either ripped off or severely damaged because of the strength of the wind. And when they say that, they mean it. So you're supposed to roll down your window, put your hand out, get an indication what direction it is, and do your parking accordingly. So as we were going to the Snaefellsnes Peninsula, we were driving up, went through the tunnel. Everything was kind of fine. It started getting kind of windy, and I made one of those infamous, family vacation comments. I said, "Oh, geez, well, at least it's not raining hard." And of course, about 10 minutes later, we get horizontal sheets of rain. And so this is taken, we had stopped actually, and I took some pictures. These are actually Icelandic horses out in the countryside, and this is just one of the mountains with the sheets of wind hitting the windshield. And I would say, I don't know what the actual wind speed was. I got to say it was 60 miles an hour or higher. It was borderline hurricane winds. The rain was just whipping. Um, the good news is it only lasted about 6 hours, and we were traveling most of the time, so it really didn't impact us all that much. But it was a real good indication of, this is a wild place, and things can change very quickly. So that gives us a healthy respect for Mother Nature in Iceland. And this is actually after the storm. This is literally taken from the front porch of our Airbnb in Olesvik, and the light coming through there, and there are some boats in the harbor. Stunningly spectacular area, particularly as the storm clears. So this is a little bit closer up of the Snaefellsnes Peninsula. Like I say, we're out here in Olesvik. This Snaefellsnes Jökull, and Jökull means glacier. So this is the glacier at the edge of the Snaefellsnes Peninsula. If you're familiar with your literature, that actually is the place where Jules Verne set Journey to the Center of the Earth. He never visited Iceland, but I guess he'd read something about it. And if you know the story, the travelers go in and then go under the earth, and they enter in through Snaefellsnes. This was a volcano at one point, and now it's a glacier. So that's kind of cool. And so there's a lot of interesting things on this peninsula. There's a national park kind of out this way as well, based around the glacier. And we'll see there's a couple of relatively famous things here that once you see, you're like, oh, I didn't know that was on the Snaefellsnes Peninsula. So there is the entrance, Velkomin, as we can figure that one out. That's welcome in Icelandic. And that is the national park sign as we go into it. This is the glacier, which unfortunately the day we were there was shrouded in clouds. I asked the guy at the visitor center, is that, more normal? And he said, yep. So it's kind of like Denali in Alaska, I guess. You really, it's like 80% of the time it's shrouded in clouds, but it's there. They have a crater, Saxhole crater, which is once again one of these really cardio busting stairways up to the top, and it's a dormant crater, but it's interesting in the fact that the landscape is, truly a moonscape. It's all this lava, these lava fields, and they're just, and you can see here, there's like a little bit of something growing. So eventually, you do see some green, and Mother Nature is very adaptive. So these things erupt, and the lava flows, and of course ends up becoming rather fertile for a long time. The one thing we learned during our Icelandic horse jaunt was that the horses really can't go on these because there are air pockets. And so they potentially could step on something, it would collapse, and obviously it would break a leg, which is a very, very bad thing for a horse. But from this view, it was just kind of stunning that it was just really this very, very otherworldly view. And further down, there's another black beach. I would say this is a much better black beach because there were fewer people there, and it was actually in some ways more interesting. There's this really interesting walkway, very much out of Lord of the Rings, that you go through here and meander through these stone formations and end up on the black beach. And there is this shipwreck that happened, I think it was right around after World War II. I want to say it was the late 40s, early 50s. There's this ship that wrecked there, and there are pieces of it everywhere still. You can see some of the stuff here. I don't think that's from that. That's too new. But as you can imagine, there's all kinds of flotsam and jetsam in the North Atlantic, and it ends up on this beach. Of course, there's sheep. This is kind of interesting. In this black beach, literally kind of in the middle of nowhere, and there's sheep grazing. But we kind of joke that these pieces are there, and we kind of wonder, they like collect the pieces up every night, then put them out the next day. I assume they're legit, and they're pretty rusted. So it's kind of an interesting story for that. And this is your view of the power of the North Atlantic, with the little gentleman down here for some scale. But it's pretty powerful stuff. And so these rocks obviously are getting eroded as the ocean slams against it. But and this was not a particularly rough day. There wasn't any kind of big storms. Particularly there was that one that we had moved out. But it's a place. This is coming back, or actually going. We leave the stone beach on black sand beach. You go back through this labyrinth here, and of course, take your picture in the arch, and you go back up to the parking lot. But it's an otherworldly place, and there really weren't that many people there. There was just a handful of people when we went to the parking lot. Very different than the black sand beach that was on the south coast. Being from New England, I'm kind of fascinated with lighthouses. This is the Malariff Lighthouse. This is where we saw the Arctic fox. Actually, it was kind of in this field right here. North Atlanta's kind of doing this thing over here. The visitor center is kind of back behind us here. So this is a great stop at the national park. And once again, there really aren't that many facilities in this area. So it was a good place to kind of load up on everything and get yourself ready for further viewing. And this is Helnar, which is kind of interesting, the fact that there's this quaint little restaurant here. And this is the view you get from the deck of the restaurant. The one thing I will say is the restaurant had a fish chowder that was $26, which even for Iceland seemed to me kind of expensive, particularly since I thought, oh, we're in the middle of nowhere, things must be a bargain. That was not the case. But once again, on vacation, and this is the view you get, so it was worth it. And the Black Church. This is the famous Black Church, the Bordur. And you're a photographer, you will see this many, many times. This is kind of one of the iconic pictures that you get in Iceland, and Mother Nature was pretty kind to me that day with some good, once again, I was there for, I don't know, less than an hour, certainly, probably less than a half hour. And just the way the clouds move over, they move over the mountains, they change the sun angle, the sun changes from the way the clouds are exposing or not exposing it. A lot of dynamic things going on there. So I said, from a photographer's perspective, it's a pretty incredible place. And once again, with this, kind of stark cemetery and the church, in this landscape, there's certainly no surprise. This is an amazing photographic opportunity that you see a lot of from Iceland. And one of the more famous mountains you'll see from Iceland is Kirkjufell, which, for those of us who are Game of Thrones fans, that's Arrowhead on Game of Thrones, which comes into the latter part of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, part of it was filmed on Iceland, and once you've been to Iceland and you watch Game of Thrones, you're like, oh yeah, that's the only place it could have been. Although I guess actually Scotland has a lot of this stuff too. But this is just like the quintessential shot in Iceland, because you have the waterfalls here, and then you have that in the foreground. You have this very, very dramatic, something out of Sedona or something, mountain. And actually, my wife and daughter were going to go kayaking right near it. There's kind of a inlet. I think it is actually part of the sea. It's a covered inlet, but it was so windy that day that they canceled it. And according to them, they don't cancel the kayaking very much, which, once again, our limited experience in a week there, it was windy a lot there, and I'm not sure how often they can get the kayaks out there. But for both my daughter and wife's sake, they did not do it that day. And that place is pretty crowded too. There's a lot of people here because, once again, this is just a kind of iconic Iceland. And the last part, we ended up, I'm not sure we can even attempt to pronounce this, but this is a quaint fishing village kind of up on the northern part of the peninsula. And, once again, it was windy that day, but it was just beautiful. You see all these boats here, and you see this little lighthouse, and it overlooks kind of the open ocean. There's some islands out here, and you're looking further, I think it's called the West Fjords, which is the really western part of Iceland that sticks out into the Arctic. and it was just the quaintest of quaint fishing villages. I was on Facebook recently, and I saw a picture from last week, and it looks very different. So, I mean, I guess we'll be seeing that soon enough, maybe in New England. But once again, it's mid-November in Iceland is not for the faint of heart. So that takes us out of Snaefellsnes. And I'm just going to do a quick wrap up, and we can go into what kind of questions we have. This is kind of just a Lokied is finished in Icelandic, and there's just no shortage of dramatic landscape. You always wonder when you go somewhere. I mean, as a photographer and having done a fair bit of traveling, I always kind of feel like you're going to get some shots. It's not really ever a challenge of that, but you're never sure. And Iceland, the weather can be very temperamental, but it was just an amazing time to be there. This is probably the biggest expanse of trees that we saw the whole trip. So I would not really call that a forest per se. And these are some sea stacks that were actually right near that lighthouse that we had just been on the Snaefellsnes with a pretty dramatic cloud. But once again, there's no shortage of amazing scenery as you go there. So with that, as you folks who've been to my presentations, I do a fair bit of research. Being sponsored by libraries, I feel it's probably a good idea to actually read some books about these places. And there's a fair amount in Iceland, fairly recent. The one that's maybe the most interesting in some ways is this Independent People. This gentleman, Halldór Laxness, actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was an Icelandic author. I can't say the novel really. This was written before it became a modern country, so it's about a farmer in the wilds of Iceland. But he's kind of a national deity there, and they have a very, very rich literary culture there. They call it the Island of Books, and there's a lot of stuff being created, and because it become a very, very popular travel destination within the last probably 20 years or so, there's a lot of books that have been written about that. And this is a woman who actually was a professor in the UK, and she went and lived a year in Iceland around 2009, which they had a financial crisis. I think somebody did ask about what's the economy like. They went really belly up with the financial meltdown in 2008, 2009. I guess a lot of their banks were very over leveraged. Not sure exactly how they recovered from it. They seem to have done a pretty good job. The economy seems to be, going along. Obviously, tourism is a huge part of the economy, so there's always a tension with that. Things getting overrun. It's only an island of 300, and somebody asked what the population is, about 380,000 people. So there's the whole challenge of the person per tourist equation. You see places like in Venice where it's just out of control, 2 million visitors and like 200,000 residents, that type of thing. Iceland's not there yet, but it is an incredibly popular place. Quite frankly, as the climate warms, it becomes a little bit more amenable. And I said, as a native northeasterner, it was an amazing place to visit, and it was windy, but it was fairly warm, and it was easy to get around. And as I mentioned before, Journey to the Center of the Earth was based in the Snaefellsnes Jökull. And with that, there is a website, icelandreview.com. It's an English website that basically gives you the up-to-date information on what's going on in Iceland from a lot of different things. You can see it's got all kinds of stuff about travel, news. You subscribe to it and you get emails about once a week that tells you what's going on. And, like I said, they do have active volcanoes, a river washed out part of the ring road back in the summer. So it is a dynamic place. And it's, if you're going to go there, it's something you want to kind of pay attention to what's going on, because it may actually, it may affect your travels and have to adjust a bit. But there's so much to see that, you're not going to get shut out of seeing amazing scenery. So with that, I'll be back in the saddle here in mid-February talking about something much closer to home, Acadia National Park up in Maine. And that'll be the 13th at 7 p.m. So look for that and sign up for that if you enjoy these. And with that, I will take questions and we will see what we've got. How many people live in Iceland? 380,000. How long was the flight? 4.5 hours. Somebody said 5 hours from Logan Airport. Where do they import their food from? That's interesting. I mean, they're Europe. And so that was one of the things. The woman who wrote that book in 2009, when she lived there for she lived there for a year, she complained how bad the food was. It was rotting, like the vegetables weren't fresh and all this stuff. So I was getting a little paranoid about, you're going to pay all this money and, is the food not going to be fresh and everything else? Certainly our experience in Bonus, everything was top notch, top notch. So they imported from Europe. And we were there in the summer. So right now, where they get it from, that's a good question. I mean, we're getting our blueberries from Peru. So that's the way the world economy works these days, and they seem to be able to get anything. Obviously, it's an island, so when you have the island, that you have the expectation you're getting increased expenses because it costs a lot to import stuff. They have any lighthouses? They have a few. I showed you the one that I went to. There was another one that was on a. The guy said it was. We got two different stories about what the roads were like, but one guy said it was very, very bumpy and potholy. And so after my experience with the blue waterfall, I decided not. Do you recommend going on your own, or is a bus tour more advantageous? Once again, that is purely on your own preference. At this point, we like being able to control our itinerary. The buses, you're going to go where the bus is going to go, and they're going to try and cram in as much stuff like the bus tour on the Golden Circle. You're going to see a ton of stuff, but you're going to see it, probably in like 15, 20-minute increments. But, you don't have to worry about driving. You don't have to worry about, finding your way, worrying about that you're on a potholey road or whatever. So it really is kind of, your personal preference. Right now, we like kind of doing it on our own, but I can see both ways. Thank you. Are there any efforts to bring the forest back? I really haven't read anything about that really. I mean, it's a very, it's a Northern European country, so it's progressive in that regard. They're very aware of, the environment and stuff like that. So I think there are some initiatives to start bringing things back. But it's, it's a major overhaul because as they went down from 25 to 40% forest to 2%. So that's going to be a huge undertaking. Plus, as the climate warms, the different species that are there are going to be differently adaptable. So there's a lot of variables moving there. But like I said, we didn't go to any museums or any certainly environmental tours. I'm not sure specifically what's going on. Thank you for the nice, kind words about the videos. And says their famous sage, don't like the weather, wait a few minutes. It's so true. It is so true. What month did we go? We went to the end of June and early July. What camera and lenses do I use? That is a topic probably for another day, but this one I used a Lens Baby lens, which is a specialty artist lens that gives you kind of a blurry bokeh, as they call it, bokeh. I also used a Leica point and shoot, which has a very long telephoto. It's very small and compact, so I could take it anywhere you go on these hikes. You don't want to be, be bogged down with it. So I didn't actually bring a ton of equipment. And the iPhone, it works pretty well. You can do long exposures with the iPhone. If you use the live function in iPhone, you can get the waterfall, silky effect in a waterfall just with an iPhone picture. Now, it's not very big. It's only about like half a meg, so you can't really make a big print of it. But certainly for presentations like this, it works great. And you don't have a tripod. You don't have a neutral density filter. Neutral density filter, all this different stuff is unbelievable, which you can do with a handheld thing. So really between those three cameras, I was able to do, I didn't really have any regrets about what I took. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, we'll see about in the Q&A. We'll wrap this up. The Airbnbs, I had to say, we want you to do your own research as to what they are. They were all pretty much the same. It really is just something you want. We didn't rent a car for the first couple of days, and then we got to rent a car, and we had to park. Like I said, the parking wasn't horrible there, but you had to pay attention. You had to go to, different times with different rates and different lots and stuff like that. So it kind of depends what you want to do. I thought ours worked pretty well. We spent 5 nights in Reykjavik and 2 nights in Olsvik on the Snæfellsnes, and that worked out pretty well. What is an F road? An F road is a, excuse me, kind of an undeveloped road. And like I said, you will, a lot of times there will be a river that goes through the road. So in order to continue on the road, you have to ford the river. And there are people who do tours there. And I said, if and when I go back to Iceland again, I might want to look into that because they have these 4-wheel drive vehicles that have a very, very high elevation, high clearance. And so they can go through the river. But an F road is something that, when you rent your car, they tell you, if you go in an F road, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble and you're going to be basically owning that rent a car, which you do not want to do. Is there an easy explanation of how come the viewing of the Northern Lights is more dramatic through the lens of a camera than the naked eye? I don't. I really haven't we got the Northern Lights around here recently. I haven't spent much time photographing it. The sensor is just more sensitive to light. I mean, I have an infrared camera, so there are different things you can do with a sensor that make it more sensitive to visible light than an eye. And one of the misnomers about a camera is, I mean, a camera is different than the human eye. And so a lot of times you're doing editing and stuff like that, or even with color, you will come back and say, that's not exactly what I thought I remember. And of course, once again, your memory isn't even the same, but there are certainly difference with the sensitivity and the wavelengths and the visible spectrum. There's definitely sensitivity that the camera is more sensitive to it than the human eye is. And so when you take pictures of the Northern Lights around here, you look in the sky, you might see a little bit of rose. Take an iPhone picture, it's like, oh my gosh, there's all these streaks and everything. But they are two different mechanical animals. How much time did you take to research and plan your itinerary? Was it a family effort? It was definitely a family effort. My daughter gets a lot of kudos. My wife gets a lot of kudos. We were all involved in the planning. I have to say probably most of the planning from my itinerary perspective was done by my daughter. I do a lot of background. Like I said, usually we're doing visiting museums and stuff like that. So that's kind of my specialty, is finding out what's in those places and trying to maximize, as your limited time in these museums. But my daughter definitely planned out the itinerary, the whole thing of the 5 days in Reykjavik, the 2 days in St. Felsness. That was definitely in hers. And then we each kind of had a thing we wanted to do. I wanted to do the Icelandic horses. She wanted to do the spa. And I forget who wanted. I think my wife wanted to do the kayaking or vice versa. So we each kind of got an activity we could do. Unfortunately, one got canceled, and one terrified a lot of us with the. Are there fossils in Iceland? I'm not sure. Sure. How obvious is climate change noticeable? I don't. It's always an interesting one. I think the melt from the glaciers obviously is the most noticeable. Once again, I don't have any perspective there to say, oh, the glacier was like this 20 years ago. Today it's smaller. I mean, you see that in Alaska. That is the biggest thing. And, all these waterfalls are amazing. But when you think about what's feeding those waterfalls, it's glacial runoff. So I would assume as the more the glaciers melt, the more intense the waterfalls are going to go. So that probably is the most visceral way you're going to be aware of climate change. Okay, I think that is it. Thanks everyone so much. Have a great evening, and hopefully I'll see you in the early part of the year to talk about Acadia. Thanks again.